I was asked to really tell you my story this morning, which at the end of the day is how we all communicate properly, is our stories. We all have a story, whatever age we are, and at the age I am now, I have many, many stories. But knowing that you are, as I understand, primarily 15 to 30, 35-year-olds here, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my history in that period of my life, and then what really inspired me to have a big shift, actually in my late 30s, really, just after 35, at that point being a mother and a businesswoman, to a more spiritual way of living and a more understanding of the values that I had in my heart and the values that really resonated with the world, and I think the values that Amma certainly works with as well. So a little bit of my personal history. I was, or I am, the grandchild and great-grandchild of immigrants to the UK who came from Eastern Europe in the pogroms as Jewish refugees in sort of, I suppose now, what was 150 years ago, 100 years ago. And my family settled in London, and my father, after coming back from the war in the Far East, started a meat business, family business. And I was always really taught and shown by my parents that if I wanted to buy myself the latest dress or spend money or achieve anything, it was really up to me. I think that sort of immigrant mentality in many ways of having to work for what you want to achieve was very healthy, actually, for me, I think. So I started as a teenager working in my family business on my weekends and after work, and learnt about people, and learnt when you're working in a butcher shop in a local suburb, dealing with people every day, you understand, this was the 60s, early 60s, how people connect and resonate, and community, actually. It was all community in those days. So 4 big supermarkets. And from there, I realized quite early on that there were aspects of school that I loved. I was made kind of form captain many times and was always organizing the social activities of my class and my year. But academically, the traditional education was and still is not something that I could really relate to. And I left school at 16, learnt to be a bit of typing, if you did in those days. You can imagine a time without technology, without mobile phones. So I was there typing and doing shorthand, and became a secretary on a teenage magazine, the first teenage magazine we had in the UK for girls, which was really exciting. So it was a time when rock and roll music was just starting, and we had the Beatles, just before the Beatles, but we had a lot of fantastic music from America, from the UK, and I was there writing stories about it. I was invited to all the fashion shows, to all the concerts, and for a 19-year-old, it was a really exciting time, but I got so interested in the fun bits that I didn't actually focus too much on the work bits. So I left the job after a while and went to train as a journalist. The industry of PR hadn't hardly started in its contemporary form in those days, and I went to work for a big public relations company. I started understanding about influence and how we can tell stories that will create some kind of awareness. In those days, the awareness I was creating was on things like drinking chocolate, and other very important areas of life. But I started at least understanding the connection between, well, maybe even I was born with it, of actually using intuition and relationship building as a way of connection, even in my work. And I think that they are very feminine traits, the whole relationship building, networking aspect of life. And if you look back thousands of years and you see how men were the warrior hunters and women were sitting in the tribal circles, looking after the children collectively and growing the grains collectively, there is a pattern, if one looks at those archetypes, in how we were then, that is not how we are now, but it's certainly the way we connect and how we communicate and how we resonate with each other. So I'm sure not in this organization, because to be part of this, you are open and you are connected, male and female, and the whole gender issue becomes far less important, particularly with a woman leader that you have. But in the real world, as you know, because you're also living in the real world, even today, we've got a situation where, as strong as women's voices are becoming, we are still way, way behind in the reality of equality in any shape or form, whether it's business, civil society, education, any area of life. It's still very much controlled by men. And shifting to the modern day, if we look at what's been going on politically in the world, I know, of course, in this country we have a woman leader, in the UK we have a woman leader, but it's women that are living their lives by being men in a way, and not living their lives according to the feminine. So when you see Theresa May or Angela Merkel holding Donald Trump's hand, maybe it's a little bit of a feminine energy coming out, but it's a very different world. In the world that I was growing up in my teenage life, in the 60s, it was even, if you can imagine, far, far way back to even where we are now. And we didn't challenge it. We didn't even think there was anything strange about the language we used, the male language, the fact that everybody in some kind of leadership role in business or academia was always men. It's just the way it was. So working on a teenage girls magazine in the 60s was quite a breakthrough in a way. We didn't realize it at the time. We certainly didn't think of ourselves as feminists, but actually it was quite an interesting period. And from there, when I was about 20, 21, I decided to start my own business. I hadn't even thought twice about it. In those days, it seemed so much easier because it didn't cost a lot of money. I came from, as I said earlier, generations of refugees who did create their own businesses because that was the way they fed their children. I also came, I must say, from a long line of strong women, matriarchal women who ran the families. I had not only my own father who was sick, but my grandfather and my great-grandfather. So certainly that's far back I know that along my women's line, it was quite the usual for the women of the family to have the responsibility for feeding the children and running businesses. My grandmother, when she was 18, started a hat business. That was the hat business. And my grandmother my friend Gloria asked me about, was I running a hat shop? I couldn't think where that came from. My grandmother ran a hat shop in 1918 or something like that, when she was 18 years old. So I come from this entrepreneurial women's background, which I don't think has done me any harm, far from it, done me a huge amount of good. And my daughter, in turn, now has health food business and is a women's leader in her own right. And my granddaughters, I have 7 grandchildren, but my granddaughters I can see also moving into their leadership roles. So it's kind of healthy to look at one's own family as much as possible and get one's inspiration and see the patterns. And if those patterns don't suit you, then we have the opportunity to change them by our own belief system, of course. So to go back to the time when I started my own business, I met a young fashion designer the same age as me. Actually, we were about 21, called Catherine Hamnett. Now, I don't know if you know that name, but Catherine and I together started doing a range of T-shirts in the 90s, the Live Aid that was referred to by Nat. If you can remember those big, you've got Generation Peace T-shirts, but I'm sure you've seen those very big graphic T-shirts with all sorts of slogans on. They're out there again. And I took her to a Buddhist exhibition, and it was based on peace and harmony. This was 95, where are we now? I don't know, 25 years ago. But we're still talking about peace. We are still, thank goodness, and we were then. And from that, she created these slogan T-shirts that became very, very fashionable in the 90s, are still being used today. And creating messaging. I mean, it seems so obvious. You're, in a way, for your generation, when I'm looking around, you've got the Dolce Vita together, Generation Peace together, Generation Peace, Hard Rock Cafe, forget that one. Anyway, it's just the norm that we have T-shirts that are giving messages. They're part of the communications that we're all having towards us. But in those days, it was absolutely not even in the ether. So together we started promoting these T-shirts with these messages on environmental issues, peace issues, about citizenship in a way. And they, I think, actually were the inspiration for Live Aid, which for those of you who know about Live Aid in '95 was really the start of a much more, in a way, caring society in the West for young people. So I've always been part of that kind of wave of change that's come through, that wave of awareness that we can do things differently. Yes, we all love beautiful clothes and we all love to have fun and live an enjoyable life, but there's more. So as I got older, even though I was very successful, as was said earlier, in the commercial world, I realized that actually service was the area of my life that gave me the most joy, apart from my children, of course. And I got involved through my various practices. I went on a journey of understanding what I didn't know about, what was happening in the world, whether it was geopolitics, what was happening to women, various spiritual belief systems that I felt resonated for me. And I learnt a huge amount. I went to, having not gone to university, having left school very early, I went on what I considered my university of life. I traveled around, I spoke at and visited women's conferences in China, in Africa, in Morocco. And by speaking just to whoever it was I met, mostly was women, I realized that my passion was working with women. And I started thinking about the future. I live in the future to a certain extent, which is not always that healthy, but because sometimes I'm too early with things and I put all my energy into something and maybe I need to take it a little bit slower sometimes, and even at my age. But I could see that there was a time when women were going to want to work in a much more collaborative fashion, where they were going to want to leave the corporate world, where they would, whether they come from African villages that you heard about just now, or whether they came from post-war zones, or whether they indeed come from the corporate world, that they would start working in a way which was much more natural and not competitive, but we could grow something of value together and create small, sustainable businesses. So by the time I'm going over a lot of years now, I had a family, I sold my business, which was very, very successful at the time, and I also got divorced and went on a journey of life that I'd never had time to do because I'd been so busy with juggling everything that I'd never really had time to just do what you're all doing here, which is really to be present, to receive, to learn, to grow, to communicate. So I'd never had that. So that was a journey I started going in, initially through Buddhism and then through other areas of investigation, let's say, and understanding that there was so much that we need to do to change the world we live in, from whether it be environment, whether it be from peace, whether it be specifically, in my case, my area of passion for women, to be equal in the world, not to be the same as men. I mean, of course, we now have LGBTQ and the whole trans movement. So what we have is we have a lot of individuals, but there is, whatever gender perhaps you are, a more tendency for one type of behavioral way of doing things than others. And the majority of women, when feeling safe, and allowed to do what they can do that suits them in their heart rather than their head, there becomes a very different kind of world. And what I've been hearing about Emma's work today, this morning, I've been told about with all the areas of social change that she's so personally hands-on involved in. You know, in a way, I'm taking coals to Newcastle by coming here to talk to you about the things that I've been practicing for a long time, which is how do we make change from a feminine perspective in society? How do we create a new kind of world where women and men are not the same, we all have different, and not individuals are not the same, we all have qualities. So I started writing books in 2000. I went to live in California. I started another PR company. I am an absolute hopeless addict of entrepreneurial businesses, so I'm constantly starting new businesses. I retire and think that's it, and then I get, oh, no, I've got another idea, and off I go, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but that's the thrill of being a businesswoman, I guess, or an entrepreneur. And I started writing books for women. The first one was called the Seed Handbook, which you've heard referred to today. Seed is an acronym for Sustainable Enterprise and Empowerment Dynamics. And the Seed Handbook came out across the English-speaking world as the first book for women talking about starting a business from a much more feminine perspective, starting about values, talking, the first thing is, where are your values? Where is it going to give you joy? What sort of areas that are going to feed you? And I use the metaphor of planting a garden. And the book came out in Germany, actually, and in Japan. And I came to Frankfurt then to promote the book and do workshops, interestingly enough, among other places. And I traveled the world talking to groups of women about the fact that it was okay to be themselves, it was safe, and by working together and by really fulfilling their hearts, they would fulfill their dreams. And I'm very happy to say now, 17, 18 years later, I still have many women who come to me and say, I read the book, it changed my life. And that book became a whole content of showing women how once they can really have the confidence and self-belief, they can do anything. And they can do anything as leaders in their community, as leaders in business, as leaders in their personal lives. So that's really been my focus. And interestingly enough, I now am seeing the importance of the balance now between the men and women, that particularly in your generation, we now have to create the balance. We have to not hold any antagonism or anger, but nothing but love, of course, in every area of our lives. And that is how now do we create a cooperative society? I wrote a few books, and another one I talked about the future has to be based on a cooperative society, cooperation between men and women being the very first thing we have to work on, and then cooperative society between human beings and the environment, cooperative society between governments and NGOs, between the old and the young, between science and spirituality. We have to now create this new world, which I know that you're all part of because you're here, that we can actually work together in a way which creates something very, very different than what we have. And I truly believe that with all the nonsense that we read about in the media, of all the silly games that go on, if you like, through whether it's Brexit, EU, Trump, all these madness that goes on, that's that level, and we have to kind of keep our energy well away, and we're on another level, and there's so many extraordinary women and men of all ages that are working all over the world to create new kind of agriculture, to create new kind of education. And some of these are not new. They actually go back thousands of years. How we can work with the land and be one, how we stop using chemicals in our bodies to heal ourselves because actually we're just damaging ourselves more. How we can work with herbs, how we can value and really listen to the wise women and wise men. I mean, I'm now 70, so I'm now considered a crone. I hope I'm wise sometimes, and I have other friends of this age. Sadly, very sadly, I've lost a lot of extraordinary women, particularly friends who didn't make it through this lifetime. But those of us who, to the age I am, but for those of us who have, it is now our time to be here for you, to be here for the generations to come, to be here for my grandchildren. You may or may not know of the 13 grandmothers who are Indigenous leaders in their 70s and 80s who come together every now and then and are really putting out a vision as they see the world. They talk about the 7 generations to come. That's 7 generations to come from my generation. And that's the generations we really have to care for and create a world for that is going to be healthy and peaceful and loving. And so the more of us that can stand up, whether you're 15, 50 or 70 or any age in between, and can say, I want to live my life based on love, not fear, has to be the way we can all go forward. And at the same time, we're bombarded, whether it be through social media, whether it be through printed media, however it is, with this constant uncertainty and fear. And I feel so sad when I see the amount of depression and indeed suicide amongst young people in my own country, which is because they don't have what you all have. They don't have connection. They don't have community. They're living in fear, and the pressure becomes too much. I believe at this point in my life that there is nothing more valuable than life itself. And if we can live that life according to love, according to connection, according to collaboration, according to cooperation, and according to the beauty of it all, there is nothing but pure joy. And so I think for your generation too, reaching out to your own contemporaries who aren't in such a good space is a crucial part of what you can do. And perhaps there are grandmothers in your communities that you can even take them to if they can be of help. I've moved to west of England, Somerset, and I'm starting a wellbeing centre. I've got at least 3 new businesses on the go, which is a bit mad. Very exciting businesses about living well and living healthily. And one of the things I launched in March at International Women's Day was something called POW, which is Power of Women, and it's about bringing the generations together in my own area where I live, but the idea is to make it much bigger, where to start with women of older age and women of young age are there in mentoring roles with each other, really. I hope that we can make it grow. It's easier to do it with women in small communities. I hope it would grow eventually to be POM. Was that Power of Men? That would be funny. But anyway, Power and POM. But that's one of the things I'm looking at is what can we, as the older generation, give and be to the younger generation? And it seems to me that mentoring in all areas of life is really a very powerful way of doing that.
I think it is a generation of hope, actually. I think that there are all kinds of very positive aspects to your generation, to this generation today. You are looking for peace, you are looking for a life of sustainability, kind to the environment, kind to each other. There's a kindness amongst many, many young people today, which I find very inspiring for me. I'm not saying the whole world is like that, but there are some wonderful new young leaders coming through, like the people I've met here today, who are going to change the world, because you are the future. It's not my generation, we've had our time, we've done our best, we've laid the foundations. I've always seen myself in a way, and others of my generation, as the bridge builders or the foundation builders. We've laid it, and now your generation will pick up where we left off and do much better than we did. I'm sure of that. I think the most important thing is to live, every one of you, to live your own lives as well as possibly you can, because everybody you're all examples to your family, to your friends, to your colleagues, and so it is by example that you will be the leaders. It is from the underneath up. This old hierarchical way of leadership which I've grown up with, whether it be in business or in politics or in any area of life, has to change. We need what I call an evolution as opposed to a revolution, where we have this shift, big shift of a whole new way of being, not doing. And it really has to be your generation that takes the lead in that. I see a real dissectomy, a real sort of polarity of a lot of young people who are on a search for spiritual beliefs, who do have spiritual values, do live their lives according to their values. And then on the whole other side of things, you have consumerism, drugs, depression, suicide, and media, which is so, I think somebody today used the word vapid, it's so sort of nonsensical and gives such a bad impression that it's very destructive. So it's always the good and the bad, the black and the white, and we have to create a balance. And if we can show enough wonderful things being done, it will balance out all the rubbish that's being done, and will give young people something else to achieve, something else to attain. And that's how it's. Every one of you is a leader, and you have to move into that leadership role, whatever that means. Women, by nature, by our hormones, are happy to work in group, in community, in collaboration. As we pointed out today, women don't always have the answers. They can be competitive, they can be unhelpful towards other women, particularly older women to younger women. We have to shift that, and we have to create much more of a sisterhood. So on one level, it's creating the sisterhood with women to women, and at the same time holding the space open for men. I think the whole point is that men and women have to support each other in our male and our female, or in whatever it is we're doing, and not compete. And the woman isn't there to serve the man is not there to serve the woman. We're all there to serve each other, but at the same time there has to be this balance, and that's what we're looking for, this cooperative balance in society. That's what we're working towards. And I think for women it is easier because we are so much better at connection and relationship building and just talking. And men find it so hard sometimes to open up and hold so much pain inside. And we have to, as women, encourage the young men to speak and be part of what we want to do. But at the same time, men have to understand that we need our own space. And that's really, really important, that women need their space, and we want to encourage men to take their space and to be able to talk with their own experiences as young men, for women to be able to talk at their experiences as young women, and then when it's appropriate, come together as men and women and share. But first of all, you need a safe space, and I think for both genders and every other gender that's out there, you need your own space to be able to share with other people the experiences and the stories that you've all had. So it's going to be an interesting time. It is, again, your generation. First of all, we have a very unequal society of men, very patriarchal, running everything, and women not in any place of power, particularly still in India, in Africa, in many countries where women are allowed not to own. They're not allowed to own property, they're not allowed to start businesses. So we still have a lot of young girls that have no schooling. The United Nations did some research a year or so ago which said the future of the world is about is up to the 11-year-old girl, where the majority of the 11-year-old girls in this world are actually getting an education. Then in 2025 or whenever it is, that's when we'll have a balanced society, because the majority in many countries of young girls not getting an education is the reality of life. So we have our Western life where we're very spoilt in many ways, where we have to learn to work together, and then we have so many other countries and so many other societies where we have to create change in many ways. And that again has got to come from support and example and help. In the Western world, say somewhere like this, and you young men here, it's all about women, me too, feminism, and you think, oh, what about us? But the reality is, apart from our own world, we've got to look at the total global society and how it is so terrible. Female genital mutilation is still huge in many countries. As I said, you've got young women, girls, children not having any education, sex slavery, young girls sold off to old men in many ways. I mean, there is so much to be done. We need a really wonderful, magical, clean broom that you young people can go out with and clean up all these areas of really darkness. It's very important to look at our own community. And then it's like, think local, act global, that old phrase. It really is, yes, let's create healing and love in our own community, but that we have to look at it from a global perspective. There's no point in just the West coming richer and lovelier and more powerful, and then we just let all those other millions of people suffer. Young women in refugee camps who are selling their bodies at 11 and 12 just to bring food in for their families. It is horrible. The majority of the world, it is horrible, and we have to make change somehow or another. But what gives me hope, and I go back to calling you Generation Hope, is that there are so many wonderful young people, like all the people I've met today and others, who are out there committed to creating change in the world, and you are the future. So I have hope in my heart, and thank you all very much.